I think this is the 22nd Fireside chat. We still haven't managed to convince the university to put a real fire here, but I see that as an advantage given the heat that's outside at the moment. I'm really very pleased to have Stephen with us. You have a pretty busy schedule, I know. Maybe it's a good thing to escape a little bit to an academic environment.
It's great.
It's great.
Yeah.
There we are. You see, this is the type of man that I like, yeah? Stephen, in fact, you've been in the commission since 1993.
Correct. Yes.
You're still happy?
Very happy. Yeah.
There we are. Shows you a good place to work, particularly on. But you've worked actually on a whole range of things. Your last thing was on the technology side, yeah.
Yeah. I've done IT. I've done before tax and customs. I've done the budget, environment policy, social policy, education policy. Yeah. I've done it all.
Well, that's not a bad thing to come to tax for, because
Yeah.
it gives you a good background, particularly on the digital as well. Yeah, the topic today is very much digital taxation. I think it's fair to say, Stephen, it's probably one of the most sensitive dossiers that you have on your plate at the moment. You have a lot of actors there. You have the national governments within the EU. You have our friends in the United States that have strong views on these issues. You have the G20, which are always impatient for results, sometimes, in fact, more concerned with having the results than what the results are. You have other international organizations like the OECD, the IMF, and the World Bank. So a lot of actors that you have to bring together, I think, and that certainly is quite a challenge. Yeah. And what I think I like about this debate is that it covers everything in the tax area. I mean, we have the international issues, virtual Ps, allocation rules, transfer pricing tax treaties. I mean, that to me is who gets what. Yeah, it's about a sharing. Yeah, and then you have the other issues like how digitalization can improve the functioning of VAT and customs. And fundamentally change the interaction between tax administrations, taxpayers, and tax advisors, which in the long term, I think, is the really big agenda. Yeah.
Yep.
To me, I always say that the question when you ask the question of, well, what do we mean? What do we want to do in terms of digital tax? Your starting point is how do we get this sector to grow? Because that's the best way to increase your revenue base. In fact, if the base is growing, you get more revenue. Yeah. So we'll spend a bit of time on that. The whole question of what we mean by digitalization. There's a whole range of technologies there: artificial intelligence, robotics, big data, 3D printing, blockchain, you name it. Yeah. And one of the things that we've learned in the program that we've had here at Vienna over the last 14 months, you can't focus on one of these technologies. You've got to look at the whole range and how they interact, yeah? And that's when you really are able to exploit some of the benefits of that, yeah? So with that, we'll kick off the debate. It'll be the usual format that we have. We have a virtual audience and a real audience. The real audience, thank you for coming. The virtual audience, it's a record number. We have more than 100 people online from as far away as China, the United States, Brazil, a whole range. So, you always have a drawing power, Stephen, yeah? So we'll see whether you meet those expectations. Yes? So virtual audience and a
No pressure. No pressure.
No, just a little bit of pressure to get you on your toes. 4 rounds we'll go through. Informal. The experience that we've had in the past, we never complete the 4 rounds, but it's good to have ambitions. We'll see how it goes. And maybe before we start the first round, is there anything you want to say in the beginning? This is the difficult question. Huh? You can just say no.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I think it's a great event. I'm very sad that there's no fire. I was really looking forward to the fire. It's quite hot here, but that's a bit of a shame. But I think it's a really interesting format, and I think you're on the button in your introductory remarks that we have these kind of 2 issues that we're dealing with. One is taxation of digital economy and how to deal with that, but also then this bigger question about the impact of digitalization on administrations and on the way tax works. And I think that both are important, and we shouldn't forget the second one, because I think that's actually the bigger question, as you quite rightly say.
And it's no accident, I think, that the countries that are leading the digitalization of societies are small economies like Estonia, Finland, Singapore, Israel, Rwanda. Mm-hmm. Rwanda is a leader in Africa in this area, yeah? And I can explain to you off the record why that is the case, but I won't do that publicly, yeah? But even they are a leader, yeah? And in a sense, that is no coincidence, because if you're a small country, you're always thinking, how do I position myself, yeah? and positioning yourself, in fact, as the digital place to go is a way of making yourself more competitive. Yeah. Well, why don't we move on then to the first round, which is really a question of what are of the technologies, the ones that I've mentioned, which do you see as having the biggest impact on tax, the potential, because in a sense, I mean, we're already moving away from servers to cloud computing. Is that making a big change? Artificial intelligence, blockchain. What do you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot going on out there, isn't there? I think the probably the single biggest impact over time will be artificial intelligence, which is exploding at the moment. I mean, it's in a hype cycle, but I think it's a fully justified one, and I think that the impact of that is going to be very deep because it can impact both the way in which tax administrations run, and I think really quite fundamentally impact and improve that if we can get to grips with it. And it can also impact, I think, quite fundamentally all the work around compliance and revenue collection because it takes you potentially to different levels of intelligence about what's going on in the system. Now, of course, you need to be equipped to actually exploit that technology, and I'm not sure we're there yet. Maybe we'll get onto that later on. But I think in terms of the disruptive potential of technology, I mean that would seem to me to be at the top of the list. I mean, linked to that, and partly dependent on it, you've got all the work on data analytics. And again, I think data analytics is something which I think certainly tax administrations already have experience of. There are good examples of where data analytics is being used to improve compliance and revenue collection. But I wouldn't claim that the problem is completely solved yet, and so I think there's more that can be done there as well. We have some good experiences of that at European level, but certainly we can do more. It's one thing to be collecting the data, but then the question is, what are you doing with it? And I think that we're better at the moment at collecting the data than actually applying analytics and implying intelligence, including artificial intelligence, to fully exploit the value from it. So there I can see quite a lot of very, very clear potentials. You mentioned blockchain. I think blockchain is potentially also very important.
But if I say blockchain, what's the first word that comes into your mind after that? Blockchain, what would you say?
Distributed ledger technology.
Okay, he knows it, yeah. Damn it, yeah. Because normally if I say that to a commissioner, it's, blockchain, next word, Bitcoin.
Yeah,
and the next word, bad. B, and B.
Yeah, no.
Yeah? Bitcoin, and that's what we got to, I mean, I'm so happy to hear you say digital, because it's the technology that lies behind blockchain.
Yeah.
That's where the potential is. Huh?
Yeah, no. So I see blockchain as potentially a tool that can be quite useful, but I don't see it. I mean, for me, blockchain is different from artificial intelligence, which is a much larger, I think, wave hitting us. And blockchain is a potentially very interesting way of doing things. We're experimenting with that in the European Commission.
Do you have a digital roadmap in the Commission?
Yeah, we do. We have, I mean, at sort of macro level, we have an entire department in the Commission, which is obviously not mine, but one of my colleagues, responsible for promoting the digital single market, and a lot of work going into that, a lot of research money going into that. So, I mean, we'll be spending up until the end of 2020 between 300 and 400 million euros on blockchain alone.
I'll chat with you later on.
Blockchain alone. So a serious amount of investment going on at European level on the whole digital space, on data policy, on blockchain, on artificial intelligence, on supercomputers, and all this kind of stuff. So there's a very clear agenda for trying to push for progress at European level. So that's the overall strategy. Then, so what are we doing at a policy level? I think each department in the Commission is looking at how does this impact on the policies for which we're responsible. And if you look at tax policy, fundamentally the functions of tax policy, I mean, don't change, and digitalization doesn't really change the functions of tax policy, but the way in which you do it is going to change quite fundamentally if you are able to fully exploit this technology. So blockchain can be an enabler if it's deployed correctly, to do things, I would say, potentially quicker, to do them cheaper, and to improve data quality as well. But it's not a panacea. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not a sort of an evangelist of blockchain, but we're certainly experimenting with it to see whether we can get
Well, we
any
have. I
value
mean,
out of it.
the average blockchainer is about 18 years of age, so they're very
Yeah.
enthusiastic. Yeah, and we are at a hype, and you have to be very careful of that. But I think the interesting thing is to look at behind the blockchain and to see distributed ledger, how it works, smart contracts, and there's an enormous potential. But one thing that I think we've seen in the program we've had here over the last year, to get the full benefits of these technologies, you need to have a good dialogue with businesses, both the tech companies and the real businesses like Siemens and GE. Yeah?
Yeah.
And you have a format for bringing in that dialogue in the commission?
Yeah, we do. I mean, we have a range of ways of doing it. At the sort of digital policy level, I think there's a very dense interaction with business. We have a blockchain observatory, which has been recently set up, which brings together a wide range of expertise from the private sector, precisely to help us shape and develop this policy. That's not a tax specific thing, but that's a generic thing. And in the tax area, we spend quite a lot of time talking to business. We have various fora in our specific areas, so in the VAT area or whatever, where we will interact with business. And I spend quite a lot of time talking to tech companies as well, because part of my responsibility in the department is running the IT connectivity layer, bringing together European member states' tax administrations. So that brings us into contact with the large IT companies, and we have quite regular exchanges on what's going on, which is very useful for us to kind of sense the atmosphere. Yeah,
because I mean, I think my experience has been that many tax administrations, they're about 2 to 3 years behind the curve. Yeah, they're dealing with the technology of yesterday, not the technology that's going to hit them. And I think that's why it's important not just to be talking to the big companies like Amazon or Apple, but to be talking to the next generation of startups, because that's where the new ideas are going to develop.
Yeah.
Some will fail, some will be exciting, a possibility. So having that debate, I think, is helpful.
I think that's very important, and I think at a policy level, it's very difficult to do that, but it's something that we need to improve on, because what I see is that the speed with which these things are developing in the private sector is remarkable, and so the way scale-up companies are moving is incredibly fast, and they're in a matter of years having a profound impact on certain businesses and certain processes. And as you say, we're still a little bit behind the curve, and our legislation is very slow to adapt, and so we risk this gap getting bigger as our legislation becomes a little bit sort of rooted and out of date, while what's happening in the marketplace and the potential of this technology just explodes. Now, at some point, that gap becomes so big that it becomes a little bit difficult to bridge or to sustain.
I think that's a very good point on legislation, because in a sense, that legislation was very much developed in an analog age. And the question is, does it facilitate the type of digital transactions? And even to the point where, the traditional way by which you transport policy into legislation, because typically you decide the policy, you then have a parliamentary council that drafts the legislation to implement the policy. IT people are nowhere near that. And yet, if the legislation is drafted in one way, it may work from an IT perspective. If it's drafted in another way, it may not work. So you actually have to have the IT people sitting down at the level of drafting as well. So there's a whole sort of change in culture in terms of the way you need to work.
Yeah, and the legislative process needs to become more agile if we're to stand any chance of keeping up. And that's currently, difficult to deliver within the constraints that we have. So there's one aspect is how to make the legislation fit for purpose, and another aspect is maintaining the contacts and the density of contacts and conversations with the different players out there, so that it's relevant. Because the worst thing is to rapidly update legislation to find that it's still not relevant or it's still not fit for purpose.
Let's move on to the second round, then, which is really about what are the opportunities do these new technologies offer to transform the EU tax agenda? Whether we're talking about customs, whether we're talking about the VAT, the consolidated corporate tax base. Where do you see the opportunities? Over the next 3 to 5 years.
Well, I mentioned some of them already. I think that. So on the one hand, we have been experimenting with blockchain. Indeed, there's a bunch of colleagues from the different member states meeting today in Malta to have a whole seminar on blockchain, where we've been presenting a proof of concept we did in the excise area. So here we have excise goods where there's already a digital system called the ECMS, which is the excise control movement system. But we did a proof of concept there to see, well, what value could a blockchain approach bring to this existing system, where you're under fairly controlled circumstances moving an excisable good from one member state to another, which requires notifications and certificates moving backwards and forwards as the things move around. And it was a successful proof of concept in the sense that I think we've demonstrated the potential of the technology, but this is not something that we're now going to roll out and go live with. It was to test and see. And we're now looking to see if we can scale that and actually try to apply a blockchain approach to another area of activity, again linked to excise. So one thing is we've got either pilots or proofs of concepts where we're trying to suck and see what the technology can bring to us in real time, because we have IT projects which might be fitted to that.
And I think that's probably is the right approach, because a lot of this technology is not quite there yet.
No.
And if you're a tax commissioner, if you're a customs, you can't take the risk of jeopardizing your daily inflow of revenue. Yeah. So always the key question is, how do I make the transformation, but how do I protect my revenue with the old system that you have? And the customs and the excise is an interesting one, because there's an interesting pilot study going on at the WCO. Yeah, where the WCO, Korea, Kenya, and Maersk, the big, and IBM. Yeah, and what Maersk has found is by using blockchain, they actually have reduced their transaction costs by 40%. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just think of that in terms of trade facilitation. Yeah, what that would do if you generalize it. Yeah, so I think you're on the right track there in terms of
Yeah, no, I mean, so we're experimenting because precisely you don't want to sort of jump in and do something on a sort of grandiose scale and then find that it doesn't work. So we're being progressive about it and testing. Another example to give you from the area of VAT is a pilot we're running, which we call transaction network analysis, which basically will facilitate real-time exchange of information on VAT transactions across borders. It builds on a pilot that was originated in the Benelux, where they were exchanging information between Belgium and the Netherlands, and now we're scaling it across the European Union in a pilot project phase. And the idea there is to give this real-time information to the tax authorities so they can spot the emergence of fraudulent networks in real time, as opposed to the current setup where fundamentally if you're looking for these things, you're basically sending an email to a colleague in another member state saying, what do you think about this? And then maybe a month later you get a reply, and then by the time you've sorted it out, the trader
the missing trader has
disappeared.
Gone missing.
Has disappeared, exactly. So that's a promising pilot and something concrete that we're actually now working up.
And are member countries buying into this, or
yes.
do they fear this is just another bid by the Commission to get more powers?
No, this is, as I say, it's emerged as a pilot project through our program, which is called Fiscalis, which is an opt-in program in the sense that you can start a specific project, and the member states who are interested can join in. And I think we've now got almost all member states on board for that, but it's completely voluntary. So the value is clearly there. Otherwise, they wouldn't be volunteering. You're right. The customs area, I think, is also high potential. I mean, we're following the Maersk IBM project, and we've had presentations on that. And I think that there are other areas as well. We have another proof of concept running, or that we'll be launching in the customs area around the temporary movement of goods for exhibitions. There's a particular process there called the ATA Carnet, which is temporary authorization booklet that you need to have if you're, importing cranes or exhibition material from one country to another. There's sort of paper process there, and the idea is to see whether we can use a smarter technology there for that kind of thing. So quite a lot of activity to sort of suck this technology and see what it can do for us.
If you move from the indirect to the direct, I said, you see the potential here for this technology to help you on the consolidated corporate tax space moving forward, or is that still too?
I know the first challenge for the CCCTV is to get it adopted.
I don't know, what, 19 years you've been discussing it? No, it's not bad.
No, this new proposal is only a couple of years old now, so I think we're still in the early phase of that negotiation. I think, potentially digital technology has a role to play there as well, but I don't on the CCCTV. I don't think that the deployment of digital technology is a fundamental enabler or precondition to the success of the CCCTB. That's a different debate, and there's some politics involved in that as well. But I can certainly see the value of applying digital technology in the world of direct taxation. And I come back to my earlier point about data analytics. We've now got, I think, 5 or 6 different amendments to the Administrative Cooperation Directive, under which member state tax authorities exchange information with each other, whether it's on rulings, whether it's on beneficial ownership, and so on. Now, that's already a big step forward in terms of transparency. The next question is, how much value is being extracted from that information exchange, and how can collectively analytics be applied to that information to extract the value and to spot the things that need to be spotted? And I think that's the developmental area that we still need to work on.
It comes back to the point you made earlier that, in a sense, I mean, today tax administrations have unprecedented access to information. Whether it's the country-by-country reports, whether it's the master files, the exchange of information, disclosure. And one of the things that's really important is that they use, and they're seen as to use in this, because otherwise you get a political backlash. You say you get all this information, change. And that's where the technology comes in, I think. Being able to use the technology to actually, essentially to have better risk management, because that's the name of the game. Good technology, good risk management, more selective audits, and more effective use of resources. Huh?
That's one. That's one game, and then the other game is the whole game about quality of service and sort of relationship management in terms between the administration and the taxpayer. So to what extent can you deploy this technology to make it easier for people, whether they're individuals or businesses, to pay the taxes? To what extent can you simply play to people from the range of information that you have at your availability? This is how much tax we think you owe us. Please, either disagree or pay it, without having to go through the rigmarole of a tax return. I think that is not science fiction. I think that is certainly an attainable goal, but it requires a lot of transparency and a lot of trust. It's not easy, but it's feasible.
And does it? That one of the dangers that, picking up your issue of trust, is that there's a risk that, in fact, that these technologies shift the balance of power away from the taxpayer to the tax administration. And you have to address them, whether it's concerns of confidentiality, concerns of how the information will be used. And we need to address that up front, I think, because that is a key issue.
You're right. I think at the moment, tax administrations fundamentally, I think, have a good reputation and a good degree of trust among taxpayers. It's important to maintain that. In the digital data space, we now have the General Data Protection Regulation, which has just come into force, which I think does give quite a lot of protection to citizens about the way the data is being used, but it doesn't protect them entirely from the taxman, because the taxman needs to have some access to information in order to do that job properly. So you need to find a balance. And I come back, I think transparency and trust are absolutely fundamental. And that's something that a lot of effort needs to be going into showing. But I think there are positive experiences where we can see that you can push digitalization to quite a high degree while maintaining high levels of trust, because people actually like to see what their data is being used for. And if you can see who has accessed your data, then you also have a high degree of trust in the system.
In a sense, it gets you back to the whole sort of debate over, do multinationals pay their fair amount of tax? At the moment, I think it's quite difficult being a multinational. You have problems in the way you're perceived by the public. You have problems in the way you're perceived by governments. And I think, in fact, that because of the country-by-country reporting, because of the master file, that's going to improve the transparency of multinationals. Improving transparency is the first step to improving trust here. So I think when multinationals say we're reluctant, this is a good investment for their part, because you're not going to get that trust unless you're more transparent.
No, fully agree.
Why don't we take some questions, either from the virtual people or the non-virtual people? And if you want to have a question, could you say your name and affiliation? Yes, I can see. Okay. Young ladies first. Go. Yes, you do need a microphone, otherwise they can't hear you.
I have a question with regards to the EU Observatory Forum for the blockchain, because And as far as I understand, the technology partner that was contracted was the Consensus, that is the US company. And to what extent the know-how that they're building by participating in the pilots and proof of concepts is going to be dissipated to European companies and startups that work in the blockchain field. And because I think it shows that there is perhaps not yet a technologically enough advanced partner within the EU to support this type of project, yeah. But how can then European companies build the capacity to do so in the future?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I'm not. I mean, I'm not an expert on the. I'm not involved in the running and the setting up of this observatory. It's done by another department in the Commission. So, I mean, I don't speak from a position of great knowledge on the specifics of it. But I think what's clear is that it's important that we build European expertise. I think that's one of the main ideas behind the observatory is precisely to have a place in Europe where we can go to and bring this expertise together. But we have to understand that not all the expertise can possibly be held in Europe, and we can't have a Europe-only approach. And so I imagine that the logic is to have a range of partners involved and to try and share that expertise. But on the specifics of how this has been set up and who precisely is in and for what reasons, I'm not briefed on that. But I mean, the information is there. I was actually looking at the web page of the observatory this morning to prepare myself for these wonderful questions. And there's what I saw was that they've set up now 2 different forums, sub forums, with a very wide range of expert participants from various disciplines. So what I think they've tried to do is have a wide sort of multidisciplinary approach and bring in as much talent as possible to have an open discussion and to share it, because the purpose is, as I understand it, to basically be sharing information and promoting an engagement and getting the digital literacy up in Europe as well.
But I think in that context, it's also important to engage in a dialogue outside of the EU.
Yeah.
I mean, because you have artificial intelligence. I mean, the biggest player in town at the moment is probably going to be China, yeah? So engaging with them. And Raffaele, question. Announce who you are. Just.
Hello, Raffaele Petruzzi from Italy. My question refers more to the corporate income tax system in Europe. The digitalization of the economy, the proposal long term of the EU, and also the CCCTB. As we were also discussing before, I guess the proposal of the CTP of the EU on the long term proposal on the digitalization of the economy, I think is interesting and is a brave one, and I guess it goes into the direction. It's a really brave one.
Brave and foolish, or just brave? Yeah?
No. It's really brave because at the end it goes into the right direction of taxing where value is created, and to recognize that there is some value created by ultimate customers. There are some rooms for improvement because not always a user generates value for a company, but that's another story, and that's probably something that will be improved in the future. But then when we look at the CCCTB proposal, and I've heard that the CCCTB proposal has been put forward also as a solution to the issues generated by the digitalization of the economy. I don't really much believe in that, because if you look at the way that this proposal works, is driving the value and the taxation by means of looking at these 3 factors that are revenues, physical assets, employees. And if you look at highly digitalized businesses, they don't have much physical assets, they don't have much employees, or at least not as much as traditional businesses. So probably the value and the taxation there will be driven by revenues, which is something that VAT already aims at doing or does. So don't you think that corporate income taxes, if we use CCCTB, is going to look like more of a consumer-based tax, like VAT already does?
Okay, that's a very long question.
And in fact, I mean, while you're thinking about it, we had one question online which is along the same lines.
Yes.
There. So, how do highly digitalized companies create value differently from traditional businesses? So it's sort of
Yeah,
in
yeah,
that line.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, let me try it this way. And I mean, you said it was a brave proposal, and it reminds me of that scene in Yes Minister, where when they're trying to convince the minister not to do it, and they say that's a very courageous minister, which is code for
Rubbish.
you're mad if you do this. So I mean, the CCCTB, as proposed by the Commission in 2016, doesn't specifically address the challenges of the digital economy. As you say, it focuses on these three more traditional factors, and so we have tried to design the later proposal on the structural solution for the digital economy to be coherent with and compatible with the CCCTB, not dependent on, but to inject into that proposal the additional aspects of the more virtual economy and the more virtual permanent establishment, but not to limit it uniquely to the scope and coverage of the CCCTB, which is mandatory only for large multinationals over 750 million, but to apply those concepts in this structural digital proposal right the way down through the economy. So the distinguishing feature between the two proposals is obviously that the coverage of the digital proposal is much deeper and broader, in that it seeks to capture all of this digitalized activity and bring it into the corporate income tax net, whereas the CCCTB is focused more on the large companies, but there's a crossover point. Now, in an ideal world, you want them both to be adopted. The crossover point to be fully coherent, which we believe it is, but it can always be improved, I'm sure, in the negotiations. And then, in a sense, two parts of the puzzle have been fixed. Now, your question then was, well, to what extent is this getting into a consumption tax? I mean, we think there's a clear distinction between these proposals and the existing VAT regime. And indeed, if we didn't think that, we wouldn't have been allowed to propose them, because we're not allowed to make proposals which replicate things that already exist. So, I mean, in our conception of things, there is a fit between all these things, and we're not introducing double taxation, but we are attempting to capture activity that at the moment is, to an extent, escaping the capacity of tax administrations to tax it, because they can't, in the case of the digital activities, actually establish a taxing right, because there is no permanent establishment in their territory in some circumstances. So, I mean, that's the way we've tried to design it. Now, these are proposals, and they can always be improved, and it's a contribution to a debate and a starting point. So, to the extent that they can be improved and reinforced in the negotiating process, then so much the better. But what we're trying to do is to progress and actually put a working model on the table, rather than having a purely theoretical discussion, because we believe that there's a degree of political urgency and a degree of revenue urgency to actually finding solutions to these problems. And for the CCCTB, the single market desperately needs a more modern, functioning, simpler, cheaper tax system, because the current system is suboptimal.
Well, I mean, if you ask economists, they'll tell you nobody who's a good economist would design the corporate income taxes as they currently are.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do you get from these really bad corporate income taxes to something that actually works in a modern economy? And I think it's important to try to address that issue, because otherwise there's a real difficulty that we'll see this continual decline. I mean, people forget, 50 years ago, the corporate income tax was raising about a quarter of revenue, typical OECD country. Now you're down to 8%, and it's going down. The decline has been disguised because the percentage of profits in GDP has been increasing. But but I think, particularly with the U.S. reforms, we're going to see more pressure from the competitive side, and the real risk is that this gradual decline of the corporate income tax, and that's something we need to be concerned about. Any other questions? Or in fact, we sort of moving on, I think, to the next part of the presentation, which is round 3, and this is the whole, as I said earlier, the big issue of digital tax and where we are going. You have lots of actors here. I think the work politically is being led very much by the G20. I mean, that's a grouping that accounts for 90% of the world economy. Although I always like to say the biggest single bloc is still the EU. You are the biggest single player in the world economy. So, 2 questions. One, what sort of contribution is the EU making to the G20? And what's your expectations of what's going to come out of the Buenos Aires summit next December?
Well, the contribution we're making, I think, has been consistent and positive. I mean, we are trying very hard to contribute to building this global consensus. We contributed a lot to the work of the task force on the digital economy. When I say we, I mean the member states of the European Union, and the Commission as well, providing some assistance. And so there's clearly a lot of technical work that's gone on, and politically, the contribution at European level, I think, has been quite significant because it's been to a large degree European finance ministers who have been pushing the debate and pushing for a faster rate of progress. Now. The discussions in the G20, I think we've moved forward in the sense that the timeline was brought forward. The interim report was brought forward originally at the summit in Baden-Baden. There was a deadline that was fixed for this year, and then the interim report was delivered in March of this year. And I think that's a positive step forward because it's always good to have a product that one can look at. It's clear that at the moment there is not a full degree of consensus as regards
that's a very nice diplomatic way of putting it, yeah.
as regards the way forward. But it's a basis for further discussion. And now the group is mandated to continue its work and to finalise the report by 2020 at the latest. And we have to see what progress we can make. But we remain fully committed to the process. So I think the important point to make is that it's not because the European Union has put proposals on the table which would, we think, help resolve the problem at European level, that we abandon the global debate. And if you look at everything that we've said, we believe that the best way to solve these issues is by consensus at global level, and we're working very hard to support that. Now, that doesn't mean that we just sit in our hands and do nothing while we're waiting for that consensus to emerge. What we're putting on the table now at European level is designed to be a constructive contribution to that debate and to show a way forward. We have to see how this is going to now pan out in the next 12 to 18 months.
Well, I think the one thing that people, I mean, no matter what side of the political divide or whether you're a multinational or a small company, people are saying we need a global consensus.
Yeah.
Ideally. So, I mean, when I look at the proposals from the Commission, this is really a way of saying our preference is to have a global solution, but if needed, we'll act as a group, yeah? And so in a sense, it's putting a bit of pressure, I think, on the OECD and on the G20 to make sure that by 2020, they come up with some globally accepted rules.
Yeah, well, I mean, the structural solution is certainly designed to give a practical example of how some of these concepts could be put into legislation and operationalized at a large scale, because we're talking about the European Union. And I think that the fact that we put proposals on the table has injected pressure into the system. It's created a new sense of political urgency. They're not universally popular or welcomed. I mean, we fully understand that. But at the same time, it's stimulating a discussion which I think needs to be had. And you can't have a discussion like this in a vacuum. And so the important thing is we put our ideas out and that we have a robust discussion about them and that we try and actually move forward. The worst solution would, in a sense, be for nothing to happen at multilateral level, because one thing is certain, there will be activity at national level, not just in the European Union, but also outside the European Union in this space. And so the idea that if the European Union does nothing, we can kick this into the long grass, I think, is a mistake. You will just see, 5 or 10 or 15 different flavors of digital taxation emerging, which will create an even bigger set of difficulties for businesses trying to operate on a global scale.
You can actually see that, when you look at what's happening in India, when you look at what's happening in Argentina, when you look at what's happening in some African countries, already the pressure is there to actually say, we need some proposals to address what these issues are. Yeah. But I mean, in a sense, you have the two prongs to the EU proposal, the short-term solution, 3% sort of tax on turnover, and in the long term, When I look at the political debate over the last few months, the focus seems to be very much on the short-term solution,
Yeah, that's the one that's caught the eye, and where the most sort of the first wave of political attention is focused on that, and we'll have to see where that goes. I mean, I think both proposals are on the table, they're for discussion, and the objective is to make rapid progress on both. Now, that ultimately now is in the hands of the member states, who need to discuss this and agree on this, and they need to agree unanimously. It's also in the hands of the different presidencies of the European Union, currently the Bulgarians, handing over to the Austrians in the second half of the year. who decide the exact mix of it, how much attention to give to which proposal. And we obviously support the presidencies in the member states in those discussions.
Whenever you put a proposal out, you normally have to do an impact assessment.
Yeah.
You did an impact assessment for the 3% proposal?
Yes. Yeah.
And what did it show in terms of the revenue potential?
The revenue potential of the 3% is around about 5 billion euros.
So it's relatively small. Then.
Relatively small, yeah.
And in a sense, I mean, some countries like Austria already have a tax on advertising, on the digital advertising. Yes, so in a sense, this is not such a dramatic change for some countries.
It's not a dramatic, in that sense. It's not a dramatic change, and it was decided to do a targeted, focused proposal to focus on the areas where we saw the gap between the sort of user participation in creating value and the effective ability to tax that activity as being greatest. And so that's why it's relatively focused and targeted. That's the approach that we chose, following the mandate that we received from the European leaders.
And is there a risk that, because in the tax area, sometimes what starts off as temporary becomes permanent, yeah?
Well, yeah, the proposal is designed to be temporary. It's quite explicit on that.
If it brings in money, people are reluctant.
Well, I think the right question to ask is what can we do to ensure that we get the long-term structural solution in place as rapidly as possible.
So this is really an incentive. If you don't agree with our long-term solution, then you're going to be stuck with this one.
Well, the short-term proposal is designed to resolve in the short term the revenue gap that member states feel they're suffering. So it's a stopgap solution. It's not designed to be permanent. The permanent solution is also on the table and is designed to replace the temporary solution once it's adopted. So that's the sequencing that we propose. Now it's up to the member states to see whether they want to go down that road, or whether they want to jump straight to the permanent solution, which would have, I would say, a larger revenue impact.
I'm sure it would, but why did you tie the permanent solution to the consolidated corporate tax base? I mean,
it's not tied to it. There's no dependency, but it's compatible with. I mean, it would have been incoherent of us to put 1 year the CCCTB on the table and the next year a digital proposal on the table, which don't fit together. So we very carefully designed them to be coherent and compatible in the space where they cross over. So in a sense, the digital proposal adds in this more virtual permanent establishment slice to the physical slice that's covered in the CCCTB, but it goes deeper into the economy because its scope is different.
Why don't we take some questions there, and then we'll come back and we'll ask your view of what's the chances of success in all of this. Some questions, in fact, on this digital. I cannot believe this is. You're all overwhelmed. Yes? Come on, Rich, you have a question. No, it's a question there. Yeah. Do you want to give the microphone?
Oh, sure. I'm Rita Sudotsky and assistant professor here in the Institute. I have a question regarding the long-term proposal for digital taxation that basically, if it's a solution only for intra-EU situations, because as I understand, this would not affect tax treaties, because for that you would have to renegotiate. Yep. Is this really a good thing from the point of view of EU competitiveness, if it's put in place only if it's realized at all, if it's going to put in place only within the EU?
Well, I mean, maybe two things to say on that. The first is that we've accompanied the proposal with a recommendation to recommend to member states that they, in parallel to adopting the permanent solution, they also update their tax treaties to reflect into their tax treaties the same solutions that we have in the permanent proposal. Well, that's who said tax was easy? There's nothing is easy in taxation. That's what I've learned in my short time in this seat so far. Then the other point is that, fundamentally what we're trying to do here is capture the value creation that is happening in the European territory in the interaction between users and these different parts of digital economy. So unless all the users leave, then then the activity is still going to be here. And so, in a sense, I think the anti-competitive part of it is a bit difficult to see in that sense.
Rich, just
Hi, I'm Rich Stern, and I'm basically from here, although I'm American. I just want to follow up on your question, because a year ago, putting an additional tax that tried to capture digital was impossible anywhere in the world. And so, in a sense, I think the EU has solved a big problem that the rest of the world had, which was, A, you can do something about digital value creation and tax it properly, and B, by taking it out of the treaty network, by taking it out of all the other problems with corporate income tax, it actually solves a lot of problems, and it's very clean. So even if it turns out not to be a long-term solution, it's still probably the cleanest way to address the problem, that is transparent. And I think that countries around the world are all now emboldened to do the same thing, where they weren't, even 6 months ago. So I actually think that the competition aspect of it is not something that the EU will have to worry about. In fact, it may even be a higher tax in other parts of the world, like in developing countries.
Okay.
you agree?
Well, I agree. I agree. I mean, and I think that you're right. The debate has really moved very fast. I agree with that. And one of the things that we felt was very important in putting the short-term proposal, the interim proposal on the table, was to try to provide a framework for our member states, and for those who wanted to do something and were going anyway to do something in this area, to do it in a coherent and a joined-up way that is compatible with the way that the treaty works and WTO considerations and everything else, so that we avoid a fragmentation of the single market, which was an approach we had as well in the implementation of BEPS, to try and get in rapidly and ensure a coherent and joined-up approach rather than a kind of a multi-flavor approach. And I mean, we'll see now whether this momentum carries through or not. So that's really interesting. Yeah, yeah.
Perhaps on that, though, I mean, some of the literature you read about the 3% turnover, one of the arguments that's put forward against it is that because it's a levy on gross turnover rather than a levy on profits, it's actually going to put European startups at a competitive disadvantage. Yeah, you're paying the tax on, no matter whether you're making the profits, you're paying the tax. Do you buy that argument, or?
Not really, no. We cover this to an extent in the impact assessment. I mean, the first thing to say is that the interim measure applies only to companies with a global turnover of 750 million euros and a digital footprint in the European Union of 50 million euros. So you're not in classic startup terrain there. Then there's a calibration question. If you're going to go down that route, I mean, if you don't go down the turnover route, what other route can you go down that ticks the boxes? And in a sense, there aren't very many other routes you can go down other than the structural route. And so it's not necessarily intellectually the perfect model, but it's the best model we could come up with that is compatible with all of the constraints that are in the system, but that actually delivers the objective that's required.
Yes.
Okay, Ivo Gerlica, I'm LLM candidate here at the Institute. I have a question with regard to one of the proposals, namely regarding the thresholds you proposed for establishing a significant presence and consequently taxation. How do you comment on, how did you came up with these thresholds, and how do you expect, because there were critics that member states are not in the same position, so bigger member states like Germany would have easier job establishing such presence that, for example, smaller member states like Slovenia, where I come from.
Yep.
What is your opinion on this?
Well, it's a good question, and we spend a lot of time looking at the thresholds for precisely that reason. It would have been, very difficult to come up with graduated thresholds to take account of the different member states. So we decided to go for single thresholds, and the idea was to, fundamentally with the thresholds, what you're trying to do is to enable the member state tax authority to establish a taxing right, and so you need to have a certain degree of activity. Otherwise, it's not significant. And so then you have this concept of significant digital presence, and then you need to put some boundaries around it. And we came up with the thresholds that we came up with in terms of numbers of users or numbers of contracts signed or amount of revenue in order to provide some calibration there. Now, you can argue that the thresholds are too low. Some people might say that. You can argue that they're too high. And typically, in a negotiation in the council, it's either implementation, it's either dates or rates or thresholds, which are the points, the pivot points, and sometimes they go up and sometimes they come down. So what we've tried to do in the proposal is produce something that is balanced and that would provide all member states, large or small, with a way of establishing taxing rights where there was a significant degree of activity happening in their territory without being so sort of bureaucratic that companies would be subject to tax even if they had 3 users in one part of the country. Now, whether we've got that balance perfectly right, we will see in the course of the negotiations and the process. But it was our best attempt to come up with a balanced approach.
And I suppose the 750 million, it's no coincidence that's also the threshold for the country-by-country reporting.
Yeah, I mean that's in the interim proposal,
Yeah.
but here we're talking about the. I think your question was focused on the long-term proposal, where the threshold is much lower. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions on that? There's one here. I mean, one of the questions that come up is this whole question of your virtual PEs. Our American colleagues seem to be very much against that, yeah. And it's hard to see how the OECD is going to get an agreement, yeah, because in a sense, you have one group, which at the moment we say the United States, but there's a lot of countries behind the United States, and I think China may be there as well. So that within the OECD membership, there's going to be a split, yeah. What happens then in the EU? Let's say by the G20 summit in December, yeah, there's no agreement at the EU. Do you put your 3% proposal in before, or do you wait until after the summit in December?
I'm not sure the December summit is a decisive moment. I mean, because now the next landing point is the next report of the working group. So I'm not sure the end of this year is a pivot point. But if your question is what happens if there's no consensus in the OECD or in the G20, well, I think we have to see what happens in the meantime. I mean, I think we've been very transparent. We've said we want global consensus. We're contributing to it. We're working hard, and we're fully committed to it. In parallel, we've made our proposals, the long term and the short term, both to show what our thinking is, to contribute to that debate, and to enable European member states, if they want to go down that path, to go down that path, because they need a proposal to look at to even decide whether they want to do it. Now, one track is therefore what will happen in G20. I don't know. We'll see. Another question is what will happen within the EU with our 2 proposals. I don't know. We'll see. So that's 2 I don't knows, we'll sees, and therefore I don't know the answer to your question either, because we're not there yet. But I mean, all I can say is we'll see.
But in a sense, thank you, Stephen. Yeah, the one thing we know at the moment, the OECD is on track to deliver a final report in 2020. Yeah.
Yep.
So in a sense, it wouldn't make much sense for the EU to do anything until that final report is out, because that's when you know whether you've got a consensus on the international level.
Well, that's one way of seeing it. I mean, another way of seeing it is that if you have in 2020 global consensus which underpins a long-term solution, which we then need to materialize in either the adoption of our long-term solution or the amendment and adoption of our long-term solution, which would take, I don't know, a year or 2, and then you've got to get on the statute book, and then you're into the mid-2020 somethings. In between now and then, you've got a period of time. And I think it's that period of time where some member states are quite keen to be able to do something. And that's where the short-term proposal has some potential effect. And that's where the transitional word comes in, because they may want to have the short-term proposal in place by 2020 to be able to generate some revenues, to then phase it out in 2020 something when the global consensus structural solution kicks in.
Yeah, because in a sense, I think the politics of this are quite interesting, because you basically got a situation where politicians are under a lot of pressure to do something, yeah? And there's nothing more dangerous than a politician that wants to do something without quite knowing what to do, yeah? And what you put on the table is quite attractive. What Rich was saying, that, it sort of says, we're all going to do this together, yeah? And of course, that means they can go back to their own electorate and say, we did something. We did something to address the problems of, or the perception that, digital companies are not paying the right amount of tax. Yeah? So in a sense, that's quite attractive from a political perspective that they can actually say we did something. Now, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, whether it raises the revenue you expect, it actually doesn't matter for them. Yeah? They just want to do something. Yeah, you don't have to comment on that.
I think it's important, given the amount of political and public pressure on this issue, that there is a reaction. We don't just talk about it. I think there's just talking about the problem doesn't solve the problem. So I don't fully buy that the politicians just want to do something and they don't really care what. I think that there's a bit more thought that goes into it than that. But the important thing is, I think both at the political level, but also at the policy level. I mean, fundamentally, my responsibility is running a policy DG and trying to make coherent policy proposals to support a political process, that we actually move things forward, that we move things down the path and we actually improve things. And if the proposals we make can contribute to that, that's fantastic. If they don't, then we have to go back and think again and find another way of doing it. But for me, doing nothing is not an option because it doesn't solve the problem.
I agree, and in a sense, it's interesting because the European Commission has a seat at the G20 table. Yeah, it's not just the some of your member states, but that you actually have a seat at that table. Yeah, so that gives you a chance to influence the debate. Any other questions on digital before we move on? No, there's nothing on. Well, there's one. I mean, okay, which just takes us back. One of the virtual audience is asking, do you see the potential of blockchain to actually improve tax compliance generally? Yeah? No, this takes us back.
Yeah, I mean, I think yes, there is potentially a potential for blockchain to improve tax compliance if it's deployed in the right way. Yeah, why not? Absolutely. But is it a panacea? No. But I think it certainly has potential because it you've got this. It helps you build trust. It helps you build transparency, and it helps you ensure the veracity of the transactions, which can't be undone. I think it's potentially quite a powerful tool.
It's quite interesting because just over a few months back, we established the Crypto Economic Institute here in Vienna. Yeah. First, I had to be convinced what does that mean, crypto economy, but apparently it's a state-of-the-art term. Yeah. But what's interesting about it is that it actually brings together whole groupings of people, lawyers, tax people, IT people, business processing, management, a whole range. And I think that's the way you need to approach blockchain. You pull together these different communities, because it comes back to a point that you made earlier, Stephen, that you need to see that you have an enabling legislative framework. Yeah, you need to see that you're understanding where the technology could be going, because particularly if you're in a tax administration, you don't want to block yourself into a technology that afterwards limits your tax policy options. And that, I think, is where there's a major difference, and it's why I raised this issue of the cloud computing, because in the past, if you're at the tax administration and you're investing in technology, it meant buying an IBM server and sticking it in the cellar. Massive investment, generally very inflexible in terms of adaptation. That's gone. Today, it's like, you just put your hand in the cloud and you pull out what you want. And if your minister comes along and says, well, I actually want to completely change my tax system. In the old world with the service, minister, you can't do that. We got a contract, IBM can't change it. Now, say, okay, we just change the contract on the cloud. So there's a whole new set of opportunities, I think, that are opening up because of the cloud, and also I think from the Commission's perspective of looking at a closer coordination between customs, VAT, and corporate income taxes, because one of the biggest blocks to that in the past and today is that the customs people and the VAT people, you're working in real time. Corporate income taxes, it's maybe 3-4 years behind when the actual profits were made. Well, that's going to change. And I think that's where, if you use this technology, tax administration should be able to actually move nearer to a real-time assessment of corporate income tax, which makes the corporation better.
I very much agree. And I see, at the moment, it's weird. In my thinking, there's a whole lot of triangles that emerge. I mean, you've got one triangle in what you were saying there that emerges between the increase of computing power, including cloud, the increase in the amount of data that you have available, and the increase in your ability to use algorithms to actually crunch all of that. And that triangle creates a whole new sort of paradigm in which you can work. And then you've got, I mean, you mentioned another triangle there, which is between the direct tax, the indirect tax, and the customs, where again I start to see some sort of rapprochement starting to happen. The e-commerce debate is driving that, because when we were working on the e-commerce, I mean, we started out in our thinking with a kind of tax-centric conversation, and we very quickly realised that without the customs colleagues, it didn't work. And so that's where you really start to see the interaction happening. And I think that's something that we'll see more of coming forward.
Yeah, in a sense, I think that is the way forward for many of the debates on tax. In fact, that you broaden the debate beyond just tax administration to customs, to the bringing together the VAT, the direct taxes, and technology just may be a pusher for that. In fact,
It's certainly a facilitator.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yes.
We have some questions coming back to the digital from online here. So one is the EU digital tax proposal in compliance with trade laws? Is it consistent with the EU scheduled commitments under GATS?
Yes.
You disagree? Okay, let's just take another one. Well, we'll skip that one.
Thank you.
Yeah, so on the digital service tax proposal, is there a risk that the relatively high, 3%, general and Pacific turnover tax thresholds could be discriminatory? Well, I think you've answered it already.
Well, we've tried to calibrate it, and of course there are some digital companies that are higher profit and some that are lower profit, and depending on where you're on that spectrum, the impact is different, and this is covered in the impact assessment. I mean, nothing is perfect, but we've tried to calibrate it as best as we can. And as I said earlier, that's the number we came up with, and that's the discussion ultimately the politicians need to have now.
But a lot of this debate depends on being able to identify what is digital.
Yeah.
And I mean, we tend to think, it's Apple, it's Facebook, it's Amazon, But the reality is, you look at some big companies, Siemens or GE or Alstom. I mean, these are now digital companies as well. Volkswagen.
Sure.
I mean,
but the proposal, the DST proposal, focuses on activities.
Yeah.
And activities which may be within what you would consider to be a classically digital company, but also in a classically non-digital company, but they may have activities that fall within scope. And so, I mean, that's the sort of the subtlety or the sophistication in the proposal, is that it's attempting to look across the entire spectrum of activity and capture a particular slice. Now, it's not easy to do that, but we did our best in the definitions to be as precise as possible, because it's designed to be targeted.
And I think, I mean, even within the traditional digital company, Amazon has a very different business model from Google, very different means of creating value as well. So in a sense, this whole range, you have to find a solution that works right across that range. That's not easy.
No, that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Is it on?
Okay. That better?
Yeah.
Okay. Michael Shea. Blockchain is the transport, so to speak, but is there any conversation going on around actually the cryptocurrencies, around Ether, Bitcoin, all the tokens, and from a taxation standpoint, how that can be dealt with? Because it's there, it's not going away. How does that factor into the digital economy then?
Yeah. I think there are conversations going on about that, but not maybe as many as there should be. I think it's and there was discussion, including the G20, about is crypto a currency or not, and what is the meaning of all of this? So I think it's an issue that we need to be focused on. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, certainly I've seen reports of various tax administrations starting to look at this and starting to take decisions on this about how they're going to treat some of this activity. But it's not something that we are actively currently planning to come up with proposals on in the European Commission.
In a sense, I mean, when you look around the globe beyond the EU, very different approaches are already being adopted. Some countries are treating it as a currency, some countries are in incomes, and it's if you want to kill off the market, that's a good way of doing it, no? But if we actually think there's something good happening here, then we need to get a greater consistency in terms of the tax treatment, ICOs as well, and we had a big conference here just a few weeks back on ICOs tokens, And you see, the non-tax people are actually beginning to recognize it's really important to get the tax treatment right of this stuff. Yeah. Okay, why don't we move on to the last round then? I know what's done here. Yeah, we have. Which is really on some of the broader policy questions that's raised by technology. Because, I mean, a lot of what we talked about up to now, Stephen, has been about what's the potential of these technologies for tax administrations, for better compliance. Yeah? But don't we really need to start thinking about what new opportunities and what new threats do these technologies bring for tax policy? Yeah? Whether on the direct tax side or the indirect tax side. You're not going to just say yes.
Yeah, well, yes, I think we do need to be thinking about that. Yeah.
And so,
yeah, absolutely. And so,
I mean, I'll give you a lead in. Okay, you take the issue of 3D printing. Yeah. I mean, I was in Germany, and one company took me to see the 3D printing. I thought a 3D printer was about this size. Huh? This guy, the company has a 3D printer which is bigger than this room. Yeah. And what my friends now tell me, they're even talking about using 3D printers to produce aeroplanes. Yeah. Well, what does that mean for tax policy? What does it mean for customs? Because
well,
no,
I mean, you're right. I mean, this is a real question. I mean, if customs is looking at the import of goods at a border, and the import is happening virtually, and then it's being printed on a site. Well, was it ever import? Did it? What happened?
Yeah.
It just emerged. How do you deal with that? I mean, no, you're right. I mean, these are.
And because the issues are already there. I mean, my kids now order their shoes, the running shoes, over the internet. Yeah, and you can actually produce them if you have a 3D printer. Yeah, so. Does that put at risk a lot of the customs duties? What does it mean for VAT?
Yeah, sure. Or drones. Drones moving stuff around. Drones taking stuff off containers before they reach a port and taking them inland. I mean, so it's been imported, but it sort of didn't go through customs. So how do if you're a customs guy at a port, how do you
a dog and a gun?
How do you deal with this? So you can and there are examples. Cigarette smuggling, for example, by drones is something that we see some evidence of. So you can see a whole range of uses or side effects of technology which make the job of administrations even more challenging. If you look on the tax side, I mean, in the old days it was quite simple. You had a tax authority and a taxpayer, and you knew who each other were, and you had physical establishments, and there was a conversation going on. Now you have activity which is often intermediated through platforms, or sometimes actually not just through one platform, but there may be a series of relationships facilitated by different types of platform interaction. So the tax authority actually has no simple way of understanding what actually activity is happening, and to what extent there is anything happening that they should be having a purview over or trying to establish taxing rights on. And this is not necessarily people trying to use these platforms to avoid paying taxes, for example. It's simply that the complexity is such that the whole business setup has changed. So how do we deal with that? I think there's a whole series of interesting questions that are emerging there, which take you back on the one hand to the question of the extent to which your base legislation is still fit for purpose, and on the other hand to the question of to what extent is your administration able to keep up with the pace of change? Do you have the right skill sets? Do you have the right technology? Do you have the right understanding, the right foresight, and the right speed of and agility in terms of your ability to react? And I think at the moment, probably the answer to all of those questions is no. And therefore, there's a major challenge there for public administration. I think not just tax administrations, public administration across the board. Look at data literacy in public administration is very poor. But we're now going to be a data-driven economy. So I mean, how can I make policy at European level in a data-driven economy if I don't have data literate and data scientists in my organization? This is going to be a major challenge for me.
Yeah, and I think it's a challenge for the academic community as well, because we need to be turning out people now that are not just tax experts, but are also technology experts as well. Yeah. It's combining the two T's, tax and technology, And that's the type of people that the advisory firms are looking at. That's the type of people that the governments are looking at as well. But coming back to the policy questions, one of the things you see about a lot of this digital technology, it blurs the distinction between goods and services. Huh? And that's at the core of VAT systems. It's very influential on the corporate income tax side. Yeah, and yet today, it's a mixed bungle. Yeah, I mean, what do you do when GE has an engine for a plane, yeah, and then has virtual servicing, yeah, 3D reproduction of spare parts that are done off-site, yeah. So the whole question of this mix of what's a service and what's a good is going to be really, I think, a difficult issue for that.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, and it's back to the same point. The world is changing very fast. It's bringing huge benefits, and it's all fantastic. And we want to profit from this. But legislation and your fundamental principles of administration need to keep up. And how we do that, I think, is the major challenge for us, and something that we're probably not yet sufficiently focused, I would say.
Yeah, and the debate, in a sense, I mean, BEPS has distracted a little bit from that more fundamental debate, I think, because there's also the question of what's the impact of these new ways of doing business and new ways of operating like the shared economy on our labour markets. Huh? I mean, a typical OECD country gets 40% of its taxes from employees, yes? Whether income taxes or social security. Yeah? I mean, is the shared economy putting that at risk? And I'm not talking about non-compliance, but that just basically, people would be moved from being employee to being self-employed, and self-employed is always much more difficult to tax. So I think there's a whole set of issues there.
Yeah.
Any questions on that? There's one more I have, and then this Jonathan. We got to get you on record, Jonathan. Yeah.
So I just wanted to push back slightly on the gloomy view of compliance in a digital economy. As a practical tax inspector 30 years ago, I didn't actually feel that confident that I knew where all my taxpayers were, and I definitely knew that many of them weren't paying me all the taxes because they transacted in cash.
Right.
When transactions become digital, in principle, they're traceable. So the policy issue is that we haven't got all of the instruments to follow through on that traceability, and maybe the debate is more about how we achieve that and reconcile it with genuine concerns about privacy. So I just wondered what your feeling was about that as a perspective.
No, I agree with you that there is the potential to achieve a high degree of compliance and traceability in a way that respects fundamental principles of privacy and so on. If we can apply the possibilities of technology in a positive way, there is also the risk that we don't get there fast enough, or in the time it takes us to get there, that there is a negative effect, which is that sort of all the good work that's been done over the last 20 years to digitalize tax, in the sense of being able to submit a digital tax return and the tax administration receiving it digitally and things going quite smoothly, can be disrupted in the sense that there is a slice of activity that one might want to be capturing, that one finds it more and more difficult to identify and capture because it's happening through a process of intermediation, which makes it impossible to the information is in the hands of an intermediary who is not necessarily liable for the tax. That's the person using the platform, but in a sense they can knowingly or unknowingly be hiding behind the platform, and the platform can become an obstacle in the effective administration of the tax. So then you need to have a new form of cooperation, bringing all these players together, and some of that we've tried to do, for example, in the e-commerce directive by putting some responsibilities on marketplaces. But I think there's more that could be done going down that path to ensure that effective, as you say, that this information which exists in the ecosystem. I mean, people who are purchasing are fundamentally doing it now electronically, and the data exists, but it's not necessarily in the right place in terms of ensuring the compliance. So then the legislative question is, how do you legislate to ensure that the right amount of information is flowing to the right place to enable that compliance to happen in this fast-changing world? And that's the piece that we're going to have to be looking at next.
and in a way that respects taxpayers' rights and
Yes,
confidentiality.
absolutely.
Because I think on the confidentiality, I mean, I'm just waiting for the first case to come to the European Court of Justice on the automatic exchange of information. Yeah, if you talk to some human rights lawyers, they say it's fundamentally contrary to human rights. Yeah, the way that the AIO could operate. Yeah, and luckily we haven't had that, but I think it's coming. Yeah, the other thing I think that's interesting on and this takes us back to the beginning of the debate.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, you have this depersonalization of tax administrations, call centers, instant access to pre-populated tax returns. Yes, I think one risk there is when you lose the eye-to-eye contact. Yeah, as a tax inspector, you may end up by missing something. Yeah, but quite not understanding. No, Jonathan, no, not understanding how this, put another way, getting out and actually going into a company, yeah, or talking to high net worth individuals. That gives you a good feel for how do these people function. You're not going to get that over a virtual network.
Yeah, no, well, of course not. And I don't buy the argument that I mean, not in the foreseeable future will you be able to kind of run the tax administration through artificial intelligence and get rid of all of the tax inspectors. But I think what you can aspire to do is to focus the workforce that you have, which is inevitably going to be constrained by the usual resource constraints, onto the most important tasks. And whether I'm looking with my customs hat or my tax hat, I mean, that's where you should be able to use the power of data and the power of information to do better risk assessment, better risk analysis, better targeting, so that those face-to-face conversations are happening with the individuals or with the businesses who are coming out of the various being flagged for various reasons, so that they're entities which merit attention because there is something anomalous which is being detected, which is going on. Now, if you can get to that point, then you'll see compliance going up. You'll make a major contribution to ensuring fairness, and you'll also build trust in the system because it'll be easier to tell the story because it'll be a true story that the miscreants are being caught. But that requires the investment in the technology and the analytics to be able to get to that point.
And in a sense, because you now got the data, if you get the right technical platform, then you can actually be able to identify high risk, low risk, medium risk taxpayers.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's all about risk management, yeah?
Yeah.
And people forget, God, I'm such an old man here, yeah? 40 years ago, I mean, if it moved, you audited, yeah? That is still the case in a lot of developing countries, yeah? I mean, today, a typical OECD country maybe is auditing 1-2% of taxpayers, yeah? And even that's probably too high. The name of the game is use the information, more sophisticated risk management. That means, taxpayers that are pretty good compliant, you're not going to hassle them.
Yep.
The high risk ones, you come down on them pretty hard, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions? We'll take one more. You've had one. We'll take two. You get yours, okay? Norbert. Yeah.
It's basically a follow-up on what we talked about like the last couple of minutes, and it's about transparency and trust. And you mentioned trust a couple of times. And I had the feeling that you see there is kind of an automatic relationship between transparency and trust. But my experience is more like the more transparency there is, the less trust there is. So my question is basically, what do you think?
So your personal life now, or sort of?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm talking about my personal relationships, not about tax. No, in my professional life, I had this experience. So my question is, what do you think could be done to increase taxpayer trust, or what should be done, or is there something that is already being done from the EU, but also from states?
Yeah, I see your point. I mean, I'm not saying that transparency automatically and causally leads to trust, or vice versa. I think there's a connection between the two, and they can be mutually reinforcing. How to build trust amongst taxpayers? Well, I think part of it is about showing taxpayers what's going on. So if you, for example, have a perception in the public that there are taxpayers who are getting away with it, who are not paying their fair share, and this is being reported in the press, and it's being reported in a relatively loud way, then if you can show back that as a result of action X, Y, or Z, you have closed these loopholes, and that now these activities are being taxed in a better way. I mean, that is logically going to build more trust in the system. And so I think that's why we put a lot of store on country by country reporting, for example. And I think that the more information that is exchanged, the better equipped administrations are to ensure a better degree of compliance. And the more compliance you can show, that should help to reinforce trust. But fundamentally, it's also then a relationship between the taxpayers and the tax administrations in the member states. It's not the European Commission who can legislate to create trust amongst citizens or amongst taxpayers. And that's not a directive I would want to be writing. What we can do at our level is contribute to building trust between tax administrations, and I think that that's already something that can contribute, because the more cooperation there is between tax administrations and indeed tax and customs administrations, the more robust the system is as a whole, and the less places there are for people to escape to. And I think that will build overall the robustness of the system. And I mean, we're not there yet. And I mean, some conversations with member states, I mean, I have customs colleagues and tax colleagues in the same member state complaining about their inability to work together in the same member state. Now, it's not my responsibility to resolve that problem, but it's interesting to see that there are silos even within national administrations where they have information which is relevant for each other, but they're not necessarily finding it easy to work together. There are also very good examples of where that does happen. So I think there are positive news stories there, and there are things that we can do on a concrete basis to help build and support that trust. Our programs, funding programs, Fiscalis and customs programs, are designed in part to put in place collaborative projects to get member states working together, and that builds trust. How much time do I have? What's one example from the customs area, just to share with you, is that we have a project running at the moment on the central and eastern land border, so going from Finland right the way down to Greece, where these sort of, I think, 10 or 11 or 12 customs authorities are having to manage that entire land border. Well, they're now working together in a project supported by the European Commission to exchange information, do shared risk analysis, and exchange experience about how they're managing the common threats down that border, and that's bringing benefits to them all. And that's actually building trust between them and also within the administrations. So it's a small example of where, by bringing people together, you can actually improve the way the entire system works. It brings a benefit to the entire European Union, because the better that border is managed, the better the European Union functions as a whole.
And I think in terms of trust between government and taxpayers, it partly depends on culture. Yeah, the Nordic countries have a good sort of cultural atmosphere in terms of it encourages that type of trust. Partly it depends on the willingness of tax administrations to be themselves transparent, because transparency has to be a two-way thing. Yeah. And partly it depends on history. Yeah. I mean, one reason why you see low compliance and low trust in a lot of developing countries is that some of these countries were artificially created. Yeah. There's not a feeling of we belong. Yeah. It's an old hangover from the colonialism. Yeah. So there's a lot of reason that you have to look at why that trust is lacking. Yeah. But I agree, Stephen, that in a sense, without the trust, it's really hard to make progress on a lot of these issues. Yeah. Well, look, thank you. That's been, I hope, not too painful.
Perfect. Lovely. Had a great time. Thank you.
That's great, yeah. And thank the audience for the questions. I'd like to thank Melody. Where's Melody? Melody's over there, putting this all together. The technical crew, you did a good job. No breakdown. So and talking about digitalization, that's very important. Not to have a breakdown, because I can mention some cases where that has happened. Yeah. We're not quite sure when the next Fireside chat would take place. It may be in Washington. In winter, so we would definitely need a fire there. Yeah, it may be in Vienna, in Rus, our annual conference that we have, where we'll have the backdrop will be a lake and stalks. Stalks.
Okay.
Yep, because the Rus, Eurostat will compare the highest. Yeah, this is the highest concentration of stalks in the whole of Europe. Yeah, that's why we go there. Yeah. Flying taxpayers, we call them. Yep. Okay, thank you very much. And thank the audience. Thank the virtual audience as well. And you put some great questions. I know we were not able to answer all of them, but I hope we answered some of them, yeah? So, Stephen,
Great.
my pleasure.
Thanks
Take
a lot.
care. Thank you very much.
Thanks.